In 1956, the Warsaw Pact told Czechoslovakia which cartridge its next rifle would fire. It was not the cartridge Czechoslovak engineers had designed 4 years earlier, and it was not a request. What it produced 2 years later was a rifle that looked, from 10 feet away, exactly like the one everyone assumed they had simply been ordered to copy. It was not. Its magazine curves the same way. It chambers the same round. It does not share a single interchangeable part with the Kalashnikov it resembles, not the bolt, not the receiver, not even the magazine itself. Soldiers who carried it, enemies who faced it, and collectors who buy one today have spent 7 decades treating that resemblance as the whole story. This is not a story about a knockoff. It is a story about how a small, occupied country used the one part of a weapon nobody was watching to keep the rest of it entirely its own. Czechoslovakia did not come to this moment without a tradition to defend. The country that emerged from the collapse of Austria-Hungary in 1918 inherited a dense, capable arms industry, concentrated in Brno and later at Škoda's works in Plzeň, that had spent decades building rifles, artillery, and machine guns good enough to be adopted well outside Czechoslovak borders. A Czechoslovak light machine gun design would go on to shape the British Bren gun of the Second World War, a detail the country's engineers did not forget and did not stop referencing. This was not a small arms tradition riding on one lucky export. Through the interwar years, Czechoslovak factories built and sold pistols, rifles, and artillery pieces to buyers across Europe and beyond. And the engineering culture that came out of it treated a weapon's internal mechanism as a matter of national craft, not just national supply. The Second World War interrupted that independence but did not erase it. Under German occupation, the same factories that had built Czechoslovak service weapons were repurposed to build German ones, a detail that made the post-war return to independent design feel less like a formality and more like a reclaiming. When Czechoslovakia was reconstituted after 1945, it fell almost immediately under Soviet political influence, joining the emerging Eastern Bloc as one of its more industrially capable members. Like the other satellite states, the Czechoslovak military was steadily equipped with Soviet-pattern tanks, aircraft, and heavy weapons. But small arms design, for a while longer, stayed a Czechoslovak specialty rather than a Soviet import. In the years immediately following the war, brothers Jan and Yaroslav Kratochvíl designed a run of domestic pistols for both military and civilian use, weapons chambered in calibers the Czechoslovaks themselves had settled on, built in Czechoslovak factories, carried by Czechoslovak police and soldiers. Their Vzor 50 pistol went into production in 1947, followed a few years later by the Vzor 52, a locking breech design built specifically around the Soviet 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev round then in use, roughly 200,000 of which were made at Strakonec in the early 1950s. Neither weapon was a foreign design wearing a new stamp. Both came out of the same two engineers, working inside the same state arms system, solving the problem their own way each time. It was a quiet but consistent signal. Even inside the Soviet sphere, the country's engineers kept being handed the room to design their own answers rather than assemble someone else's. That independence reached its clearest expression yet in 1952, when the Czechoslovak army adopted the Vzor 52, a semi-automatic rifle chambered in a cartridge its own engineers had built, the 7.62 by 45mm, developed to Czechoslovak specifications rather than borrowed from Moscow. The rifle itself came from the same design tradition as the Kratochvíl brothers' pistol work, built by engineers operating inside the state arms industry at Povazky Strojarna and later Česká zbrojovka Uherský Brod. The 7.62 by 45mm cartridge was not a copy of anything. It was Czechoslovakia asserting, in the middle of the emerging Cold War, that a satellite state could still design its own ammunition standard and expect its own army to use it. For 3 years, that assertion held. It held until 1955, when the Warsaw Pact was formally established and the Soviet Union began pushing every member state toward a shared logistics system, starting with ammunition. An alliance that could not agree on what its rifles fired could not resupply itself in a war, And the Soviets were not interested in debating the point. The pressure landed specifically on the cartridge Czechoslovakia had just spent years standardizing on. The 7.62 by 45mm Visor 52 round, barely 3 years old, was to be abandoned in favor of the Soviet 7.62 by 39mm M43 cartridge, the same round already feeding the AK-47 across the rest of the block. For a country that had just proven it could design its own ammunition, this was not a technical adjustment. It was an order to give up the newest and most specifically Czechoslovak thing they had built. The easy path, the path several other Warsaw Pact states took, was to accept the cartridge and accept the rifle that came with it, licensing or directly copying the AK-47 and calling the matter closed. Hungary went this way, building its own AK-55 variants and leaning on Soviet patterns rather than fighting the logistics decision on every front. Czechoslovakia's military leadership chose differently. They accepted the cartridge because refusing outright was not a fight a satellite state could win against Moscow in 1955. But they did not accept the rifle. In 1956, the task of designing a new Czechoslovak infantry weapon around the Soviet round, without simply reproducing the Soviet rifle, was assigned to Chief Engineer Jiří Čermák at the Constructa Brno Design Bureau, under the project codename Koste, meaning Broom. The unresolved question hanging over the whole project was whether a rifle forced to speak the Soviet Union's ammunition language could still, underneath, be built entirely on Czechoslovak terms. Čermák had roughly 2 years to answer that question, working against a Soviet timetable he had no power to slow down, in a design bureau whose funding, whose factory space, and whose ultimate customer all answered, one way or another, to Moscow. Čermák's team did not start by studying the AK-47 to imitate it. They started by rejecting its most fundamental mechanical choice. The Kalashnikov's operating system uses a long-stroke gas piston driving a rotating bolt, a design as rugged as it is simple, and by 1956 already proven in combat and mass production. Čermák's team, working alongside engineer Bohuslav Novotny, built something else entirely. A short-stroke gas piston paired with a tipping toggle-style locking breech, a mechanism with more in common conceptually with the lock on a Walther P38 pistol than with anything in the Kalashnikov family. The bolt does not rotate to lock. It tips, hinging on a pin the way the toggle joint of that pistol design hinges, dropping into a solid recess machine directly into the receiver. It was not a simpler solution. It was, if anything, a more demanding one to manufacture and tune, and it produced a rifle that fed from a detachable box magazine holding 30 rounds, built from a lightweight alloy rather than the AK-47's stamped steel. That was the choice, made deliberately by engineers who had every incentive to take the easier route and did not take it. A tipping lock like this carries less moving mass through each firing cycle than a rotating bolt does, since the bolt itself never has to twist against the receiver walls, only pivot. Less mass in motion means less felt recoil impulse transferred back into the shooter's shoulder between shots, and a shorter, more predictable path for the action to complete before the next round chambers. None of that shows up in a silhouette. All of it shows up on a firing range, which is exactly where Soviet testers were about to find it. The receiver told the same story from a different angle. The AK-47's receiver is stamped from sheet steel, a manufacturing choice built entirely around speed and cost, letting the Soviet Union arm millions of soldiers across a dozen client states as fast as factories could press the metal. Čermák's rifle used a receiver machined from a solid block of steel. It was slower to produce, it was more expensive per unit, and it made the finished rifle unloaded weight come in at roughly 6.8 pounds against the AK-47's 7.7, close to a full pound lighter, while matching or exceeding it on accuracy in the testing that followed. A machined receiver in a Warsaw Pact rifle in 1956 was not an engineering necessity. It was a choice that cost the state money and time it did not strictly need to spend in exchange for a rifle that was, in every dimension except the cartridge it fired, unmistakably not a copy. Ask what a design bureau spends extra money to protect, and the answer tells you what it actually values. That choice went to Moscow for judgment in the autumn of 1956, when the Kostay prototype was sent to the Soviet Union for direct comparative trials against the AK-47. This was the moment the entire project could have ended. A Warsaw Pact member submitting an alternative to the Soviet standard rifle for testing by the same authority that had just forced the caliber decision was not a routine bureaucratic step. It was Czechoslovakia asking permission to be different inside an alliance built on being the same. The rifle passed. It was judged comparable to the AK-47 across the board, and Soviet testers were reportedly struck specifically by its accuracy. A rifle built around an unconventional lock, outperforming the design it was implicitly being measured against. Official adoption followed in 1958 under the designation Samopal ZOR 58, and full production began the next year at Česká zbrojovka Uherský Brod, the same state arms factory with roots stretching back through the interwar Czechoslovak industry the entire project had quietly been defending. The finished rifle carried its independence in details a quartermaster would notice before a historian would. It could be reloaded from 10-round stripper clips borrowed from the SKS carbine, a small compatibility the Kalashnikov never offered. Its stock could be swapped between a fixed synthetic buttstock and a side-folding metal one without tools, a feature built directly into the three variants Chermak's design office standardized. The Vizor 58P, an infantry pattern with the fixed stock, the Vizor 58V, an airborne pattern with the folding stock tucked against the receiver's right side for paratroopers who needed a rifle that packed smaller, and the Vizor 58 Pi, a night fighting variant built to mount an early infrared sighting system. None of that was copied from anywhere. It was Czechoslovak infantry doctrine, worked out in Czechoslovak terms, wearing a Soviet cartridge as its only concession. What followed was scale. Production ran from 1959 to 1984, a 25-year run that produced approximately 920,000 rifles, making the Vizor 58 the standard individual weapon of the Czechoslovak army for the entire period, the only Warsaw Pact member state that never fielded a Kalashnikov variant as its primary service rifle. That fact sat inside every training exercise, every joint maneuver, every moment a Czechoslovak soldier stood next to a Polish or East German counterpart carrying an externally similar but internally foreign rifle. Czechoslovakia did not keep the rifle to itself. As one of the Eastern Bloc's most capable arms exporters, it sent the Vizor 58 abroad to governments and movements the Soviet Union wanted armed but did not necessarily want directly linked to Moscow, a role Czechoslovak industry had played since well before the Cold War. Cuba fielded it after 1959. Nigeria's federal forces carried it through the Nigerian Civil War. And in Vietnam, the rifle ended up on both sides of the same conflict at once, issued to North Vietnamese and Allied forces as a standard weapon, while captured examples were picked up and used by American long-range reconnaissance patrols who valued a rifle that looked enough like the enemy's to pass a glance in the dark, without ever being the enemy's rifle at all. What began as a mechanism designed to preserve one country's engineering independence had become, a decade later, a battlefield object being carried by soldiers on opposite sides of a war neither Czechoslovakia nor the Soviet Union was formally fighting. A rifle built to prove a point about sovereignty had turned into raw material for someone else's war entirely. By the time the Vietnam War had absorbed its share of Vizor 58 rifles, the weapon was already circulating far beyond any single conflict. Over the following decades, it turned up in the hands of government forces and insurgent movements across Angola, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Guinea, Iraq, Ivory Coast, Laos, Libya, Mozambique, Somalia, Syria, and Tanzania, along with Kurdish fighters and the Turkish backside of the Cyprus conflict. No single Czechoslovak decision sent it to all of these places at once. It moved the way arms move once they leave the country that built them, through direct state sales, through third-party transfers, through decades of conflicts trading captured stock back and forth, until a rifle designed to solve one very specific Warsaw Pact problem had become a fixture of small wars its Brno engineers never had reason to think about in 1956. By the 1970s, the very design choices that had made the Vizor 58 distinctive were starting to make it dated. Its receiver, milled and tightly fitted, offered no easy way to bolt on the optics, lights, and accessory rails that infantry doctrine was beginning to demand elsewhere. In 1977, a research center in Brno began work on a successor under the name Lada, in attempt to build a Czechoslovak rifle for a new generation, the same way Cermak's team had built one for the last. That program stalled through the final years of communist rule, and after 1989, when Česká zbrojovka Uherský Brod was privatized along with much of the collapsing state arms industry, the successor project was shelved outright for lack of funding. The Visor 58 kept soldiering on, not because it was still the best answer, but because there was, for the moment, no funded alternative. The project resurfaced in the late 1990s driven by a new motive: the prospect of the Czech Republic joining NATO, which meant a Czechoslovak pattern rifle chambered in a Warsaw Pact cartridge was about to become the odd one out in a different alliance entirely. The design was reworked to accept the 5.56 by 45mm NATO round, eventually emerging as the CZ-805 Bren, a genuinely new rifle rather than a modification of the old one. The Czech Army began fielding it as its standard weapon starting in 2010, formally replacing the Visor 58 in frontline service the following year. The Slovak Army, which had split from Czechoslovakia's joint forces in 1993, kept the Visor 58 as its primary rifle for years afterward, only beginning its own transition to the CZ-805 Bren in 2014. A weapon born from refusing to simply inherit someone else's rifle was, decades later, finally retired by a rifle built on the same refusal, aimed at a different alliance. The country that built the rifle did not survive to see it retired. Czechoslovakia dissolved at the start of 1993, splitting into the separate Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, and the Visor 58 split with it, without anyone having to redesign a thing. Both new armies simply kept using the rifle they already had, drawing from the same stockpiles, built to the same specifications, manufactured for decades at the same Uherský Brod factory that now belonged to a Czech company alone. A weapon engineered to answer a single Warsaw Pact demand ended up outliving the country that made that demand of it in the first place, standing as the shared inheritance of two new states that otherwise divided almost everything else, from the gold reserves to the Air Force, along a negotiated line. The rifle did not need dividing. It was already exactly the same weapon on both sides of the new border, which is its own kind of proof that the thing worth protecting in 1956 was never really about which country owned it, but about whether it had been built on someone else's terms or its own. Slovakia went on carrying it as a primary service rifle for another 2 decades after the split, longer than the Czechs did. Proof that the design still worked as intended long after the state that commissioned it had stopped existing. The thread that carries into everything else is the one nobody outside the design bureau ever had reason to dwell on: the cartridge. It is easy, looking at the finished rifle, to see the concession and miss how narrow it actually was. The real mechanism behind the Visor 58 is not a hidden financial arrangement or a secret ownership structure. It is a calculated trade, made in the mid-1950s by engineers and officials who understood exactly what they could and could not refuse. Czechoslovakia gave up the one thing the Warsaw Pact explicitly and repeatedly demanded: the cartridge. The 7.62 by 45mm Visor 52 round, the newest and most specifically Czechoslovak piece of the country's small arms program, was abandoned in favor of the Soviet 7.62 by 39mm standard, because that single point was the one the alliance's logistics system genuinely required and was not going to negotiate away. But that concession was made precisely so that everything the Soviets had not explicitly demanded could stay Czechoslovak: the lock, the receiver, the manufacturing philosophy, the magazine. That magazine is the clearest physical proof of the entire trade. It curves the way a Kalashnikov magazine curves. It holds 30 rounds of the same cartridge a Kalashnikov holds. To a soldier from an Allied army glancing across a formation, it reads as the same object. It is not. It is built from a different alloy pattern to different dimensions, and it fits nothing else in the Warsaw Pact's arsenal. Not an AK-47, not an AKM, not a single Kalashnikov derivative fielded by any allied state. Czechoslovakia surrendered the round. It did not surrender the object that round lived in. Look at what this trade actually protected item by item, and the pattern gets sharper. The lock stayed Czechoslovak, a mechanism no other Warsaw Pact factory could tool up and produce without starting from scratch. The receiver stayed Czechoslovak, a manufacturing philosophy that spent extra money on precision the Soviet approach never asked for. The stock system stayed Czechoslovak, built around Czechoslovak airborne doctrine rather than a Soviet one. The magazine stayed Czechoslovak, down to an alloy pattern that guaranteed no Allied army could simply raid Czechoslovak stockpiles and reload with its own AK magazines or the reverse. None of that was demanded by the treaty that forced the cartridge change. All of it survived anyway, because the alliance's actual leverage stopped at the one thing its supply chain genuinely required: interchangeable ammunition, not an interchangeable rifle. Once you see the cartridge concession as the deliberate, narrow trade it was, the rest of the rifle stops looking like an accident of independent engineering and starts looking like exactly what it was: the terms of a negotiation, fought and won at the level of a receiver casting rather than a treaty room, by people who knew which single thing they had to give up and refused to give up anything more. Every escalation that followed, the export contracts, the battlefield appearances on sides no one in Brno had chosen, the decades of civilian production, all of it happened to a rifle whose core identity had already been settled in 1956, before a single unit reached a soldier's hands. That negotiation did not end in 1984 when the production line stopped, and it did not end when the Czech army retired the rifle in 2011 either. Long after it stopped being anyone's standard issue weapon, the Vzor 58 kept turning up in active conflicts, carried by Czech and Slovak coalition troops on peacekeeping duty with the NATO-led force in Kosovo, issued to both Czech and Slovak soldiers deployed to Afghanistan, and, on the opposite side of that same war, recovered and used by Taliban fighters who had captured or bought them on the regional arms market. It surfaced again in the Libyan civil war and in Syria, and more recently in the Russian invasion of Ukraine itself. Decades of stockpiled rifles moving through conflict zones that had nothing to do with the Warsaw Pact politics that produced the weapon in the first place. A rifle built to answer a very specific Cold War question kept being handed a very different one, over and over, by wars its designers never imagined. It even made its way into how the Vietnam War got remembered on screen, appearing on camera in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, still doing the job of standing in for a war it had, in the actual history behind the film, genuinely been carried through. Military production ended in 1984, but the rifle never actually stopped being made. Once the Czech and Slovak armies began retiring their service stock, Česká Zbrojovka, Uherský Brod, and other Czech manufacturers started reassembling unused military parts into semi-automatic civilian variants. The CZ-858 Tactical, built for the Canadian market and stamped with the same profile soldiers had carried for decades. The FSN series, produced by a separate Czech manufacturer for buyers across Eastern and Western Europe, and a newer sporter line offered in both the original 7.62 by 39mm chambering and 5.56 by 45mm NATO for shooters who want the mechanism without the Cold War ammunition. Every one of these civilian rifles is built so that original military parts, magazines, bayonets, folding bipods, flash suppressors, still fit, which means a rifle bought at a gun store today can be assembled, piece for piece, from components machined to specifications set in a Brno design bureau in 1956. Reviewers who handle surplus and reassembled examples today keep landing on the same words Soviet testers used 7 decades earlier. The fit and finish is excellent, tighter and more deliberate than a mass-stamped Kalashnikov ever needed to be, because it was never built by a factory racing to arm an empire. It was built by a factory racing to prove it did not have to. In February 2022, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Czech government approved the transfer of military equipment from its own stocks directly to Ukrainian forces, an emergency exemption granted within days of the invasion beginning. Among the weapons in that pipeline were Visor 58 rifles, alongside submachine guns, pistols, and millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. Roughly 5,000 Visor 58 rifles have gone to Ukraine as part of that effort, folded into a broader Czech aid commitment that, within the first weeks of the war, approached hundreds of millions of dollars in value and placed the Czech Republic among NATO's most significant per capita contributors to Ukraine's defense. A rifle engineered specifically so that a Warsaw Pact ally could not be quietly absorbed into a Soviet weapons monoculture is now 6 decades later, back in the hands of soldiers resisting a different Russian attempt to erase a neighboring country's independence. The overlap is not poetic license. It is the same object, doing something close to the same job, against the same pressure, generations apart. The rifle that was built to satisfy a demand while quietly refusing everything the demand did not explicitly require was never really a story about 1958. It has been doing the same job, under different flags, for as long as it has existed. Somewhere in a Ukrainian unit right now, a soldier is loading a magazine into a rifle that was designed 70 years ago by engineers answering to an empire that no longer exists, so that it could never be mistaken under the metal for the weapon it was built to resemble. Same cartridge, not one shared part. That was never an accident. If you want the stories of weapons engineered to outlast the empires that tried to standardize them out of existence, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.